Hello, this is Doug, WE6Z. Welcome to part 6 of the 100 watt linear amplifier for 630 meters. This section covers the power supply. So I was able to obtain these two HP server power supplies from eBay for a pretty cheap price, about 10 bucks a piece. And then they are model HSTNS-PL14. And they're good for 12 volts at around 38 amps, and that's at 240 volts. So you can still get something like 30 amps out of them at 12 volts on 110 input power. So here is the look of the connector here. They're like a hot swappable power supply. Negatives on the left, positive on the right, and then some input pins to control the power supply, turn it on and off, etc. So they're 460 watt power supplies, and I built up a Y cable just so that I had one cable instead of two separate power cables to plug into the wall. I had to go through a few capacitors to find the ones I needed, so there's a few of them there. And then I measured the power of the power supply of 12.30 volts, set that way from factory, and there's measuring the power. And then I installed a 470 microfarad 35 volt capacitor across the positive and negative of each power supply for some smoothing. And then here's a closer picture, and then I also added the turn on resistor between the first pin and the fourth pin, counting from left to right. This will make it so the power supply stays on continuously when it's plugged into AC input power. And then the next step was you have to isolate the DC ground from the chassis ground on one of the power supplies. So you have to open the case up and then physically remove the boards from the case so that you can get to the standoffs. And in this case I had some I didn't have any nylon washers, so I decided to make my own. I cut them out of this insulating cardboard stuff that I had in my junk pile. So there's 4 insulators, and I did find some nylon standoffs that I used. This is basically what it's going to get, what it's going to look like. I glued the top of the insulating washers, we'll call them, to the top of the studs, so that when you put it together they didn't fall off. And then there it is right there with them glued on, so that when you install the board back on, it isolates the chassis from the ground, because there's some copper pads here that made contact. And if you don't do that, then when you plug the two power supplies in series, they'll short out. So one needs to be isolated. And then here are both power supplies, one of them being isolated from ground and the other one not. And just temporarily I taped them together, and then I ran a number 12 wire stranded between the negative of this power supply down to the positive of this power supply. And so you want to make sure that the isolated ground power supply, you're using its positive terminal, and the other one you're using it on the negative terminal. And therefore they're both in series, so you'll get 24 volts. And then I added a connector so that I could easily power the amplifier from that. So here's the final version here with the connector on it. It shows 24.6 volts, and it'll do plenty of power, probably at least 20 amps, but this amplifier is probably only going to draw about 5 to 6 amps at 24 volts.